This is the last sort of broad overview lecture and the last difficult topic, which will be spelling rules, orthography. Okay. Whether or not there are any spelling rules in my writing, like how people are supposed to write. As always, I have recommendations on learning glyphs if you want to play that game. These glyphs are dates or important periods of time. The first one is peak or syllable P, when it's not used as a logogram, and it's a period of 100 years. It also means 8,000, confusingly so. So it's peak is 400 when you're talking about years, but 8,000 if you talk about anything else. In fact, David Stewart argued that this is because the word itself doesn't indicate quantity, but more like a relative rank in a positional system. And it happens to be that the same rank corresponds to 8,000 in the basic like 20 base positional notation. But in the calendar notation, there's an extra unit because it's days and then 20s of days, but then you have year. And so because of that, the same word has two additional meanings. And then this is a word that means year, cub, and this is Winnie cub, literally 20 years. Now we have no idea why this little like bracket device with this rock in the middle is there. Doesn't have a reading, but it's part of the so-called initial series introductory glyph as well. And so years, 20 years. What it actually shows is a drum. And we have no idea why. It looks sort of like a drum with like two slits, like a wooden drum. We have no idea why drums and years are connected, except that people like drumming and firecrackers, the years, -2. This is the sign that refers to months, but it's also a word and a logogram that means person. And confusingly, this is another sign for 20. And they both have the same reading with some dialect. Winik, winak, winal. This is just different pronunciations of the same word. This one, though, occurs mostly with like abstract numbers. And this one occurs mostly with references to a month and to people, like person. And then this weird dark flower, cross-hatching means darkness. So the black flower means nothing. You can think of it as a, yeah.
How do they indicate darkness on the lines?
In size lines. So that's the problem. Like on painting, you put black. But when you carve, how you indicate blackness. And so it looks like my writing conventions are borrowed from painting. And so they use cross-hatching to basically indicate something that something is black. So this is written as if it were carved, right? If it were just painted, don't be like blobs of black. So black flower, or maybe, yeah, a window into nothingness, like a portal, like a teleportation device into nothingness. That's what it represents. We'll have more assignments about reading myoglyphs. And remember, they're all packed into blocks. So like here, it's a common royal title, Divine Mutul Lord, Hul Mutulahav. And Uch is on the left. That's pretty straightforward. But then it gets weird because the lower part of a how is actually covered by two signs, Mut and La. Hul Mutulahav. And you're supposed to read it Uch, Mut, La, and then the covered sign of how. And then there's a Wa at the very end. So a little confusing, take some getting used to, basically. My hieroglyphic blocks. And remember when we read, and in the future, in this lecture and others, there will always be these three T's: the transcription, transliteration, and translation. Sort of character by character representation of myoglyphs in our alphabet writing, where you have bold, lowercase for syllables and uppercase for logograms. And then the italics are used when we actually render the pronunciation, right? So that popo means pop. In your assignments, when you do the decipherment exercise, you indicated discrepancies between the ways words are spelled with syllables, right? And the ways they're pronounced. So for example, that po is not indicated in writing at all. And then finally, translation. So today we're talking about spellings, and it's very important to remember there is no such thing as an absolutely transparent orthography, like an absolutely transparent writing system. all writing systems do not accurately represent the way we actually speak, like this. But all writing systems can represent spoken language to an extent. Like here, 7 years ago, you can record that phrase with Egyptian hieroglyphs. Of course, there'll be no vowels. But the fact that we pronounce R is almost like a vowel in present day version of English is also helpful. So you have 7 years ago. Of course, with cuneiform be a little harder because some of the consonant signs we use are absent. So it'd be like puas, kuar, and 7 years ago. And then if you can use Chinese phonetic characters, you can also spell for squaw and 7 years ago, although with some accommodation of, once again, different phonology. Purely phonetic spellings are not common. So journal Le Métaphonétique famously existed for a couple of issues and then had to close. Nobody wanted to read phonetically, even in French. And all of the writing systems, even those we call alphabetic, have variable degree of accuracy in how they represent words, and not just pronunciation, but say intonation, right? Our accents, exclamation marks, commas, the actual flow of speech is very different from like letter by letter rendering that we usually do. And some writing systems are much more transparent, like Finnish, French. In French, you actually have like rules. So you know the rules. The rules are maybe a little more complicated than, say, Finnish, but they're transparent. You learn them, you can read everything. English, for example, is not like that. So all writing systems are somewhere in between, essentially deciding what to represent. Sounds accurately or meaning more or less accurately. Because we want both. We want not just read the way people pronounce, we actually want to understand it. So it's a kind of trade-off. And English, our English spellings, they're actually more towards meaning than sound, than many other alphabet-based writing systems. There are reasons for that. English is a really strange language because it borrowed a lot of words from other languages. Then it underwent dramatic shifts in pronunciation, in part because of that language context. And also the words that it borrowed, they didn't change in the same way, as you may remember, like those French borrowings, as English own like words. So say you have a word that started out very much as a Germanic Knecht, because English is a Germanic language. So it still sounds very much like that in German, Knecht. So what happens is that initial K at some point just disappeared and became N. The H in Knecht gave way to a long vowel. So it became neat. There was a time when the word night was neat. But that wasn't the end because the so-called great vowel shift happened and neat became night. So in English, we have a word that reflects the way it was pronounced 1,000 years ago. And you may wonder, like, what the hell is going on? Why is it happening? And that's not the end of it, because I'm not the native speaker of English. And frankly, it makes very little sense. Just look at those examples. Beak versus break, teak versus steak, read versus rad, and then of course, lad, lad, lad. That makes no sense at all. Or dive versus give, gave versus have, go versus do. So you may wonder, like, what the hell is going on? And most of all, why is it happening that nobody bothered to actually change those horrible spelling rules? And it turns out many people did. And it never worked. And there are reasons why spellings are so strange in English. First, because of its weird phonetic shifts. And combination of borrowed and local Germanic words, English has a lot of homonyms. So buy, and of course there's a third buy, right? Getting buy something and saying buy. So if you write them all in the same way, it's actually very hard to figure out what is going on. Or do versus do. And remember, there are dialects in English too. Some people actually pronounce as do. And if you start writing it different ways, depending on the dialect, you end up with so many variant spellings. Apparently, that's not okay. Or C versus C, or him versus him. There's a him, there's a him. And what happens here, of course, related words, you actually want related words to sound the same. So him and hymnal, even though there's no N in the basic noun form, but one becomes an adjective, you can hear that N. To want to preserve that relationship, that connection, or plurals, English plurals actually don't sound the same, whether, say, a consonant is voiceless or voiced. So it can be dies, this, tes, des, these. And now imagine everything is spelled differently. It actually makes more sense for people to see the same letter every time they see plural. That's what we call a morphophonemic function. So when the same phoneme, a marker of plural, has variable, what we would call surface expression, a different pronunciation of the plural. But in writing, it's spelled exactly the same thing, and speakers can recognize it and then pronounce accordingly. Or past tense, id, at, eat, id, same thing. It is actually spelled the same way. So in fact, as speakers of English, it's very easy for us to understand that spelling is not something very straightforward, right? That this problem with homonyms or problem with important relationships between words means that sometimes our spellings are more like hieroglyphs than actual sound by sound renderings of the way we pronounce words in English. There's an extra layer of complexity in English. A lot of these weirdly spelled words are actually what we call action words. So like have, do, and so those, they probably got fossilized early on in the history of English spellings because they're frequent words and they're harder to change. So the way people started writing them reflected older versions, older pronunciations. And as pronunciation shifted, those words actually stay the same. But now the way we learn English actually makes us recognize these words better because they're weird and they have to be learned by heart, regardless of how they're pronounced. And so speakers of English learn these function words and recognize them better because of how non-phonetic these pronunciations are. So there's an extra helping, I guess, in brackets, because it basically makes it harder for people to learn how to read, but it also makes it easier for them to read later. And there's also a big like inertia. If you try to change it, everyone who already knows how to read and write, of course, they would struggle. Which of course takes us to mind languages. And remember, even though there was this dominant Cholan language, there are dialects of Cholan, very much like dialects of modern English. And there are people speaking related languages, and they all basically share this big melting pot of the Asian Maya culture, and they use writing. Not so dissimilar if you try to imagine medieval England and different versions of English and Latin and French all spoken at the same time. We know that towards the end of the classic Maya civilization, there's an increase in the use of syllabic signs. So an emphasis on different ways of pronouncing and potentially more diversity. But there were also times when my political landscape was more unified. And that was presumably the times when there was more information flow and more insistence on certain ways of spelling words. So political centralization was probably a factor too, but at no point in time did the Mayas have anything like the Academy of Mayan Languages. I mean, they do now in Guatemala, but there was nothing like that. So in terms of the amount of variation, diversity, or freedom you had to essentially come up with your own spelling, that was more like medieval England. Everything was written, nothing was printed, there was no mass production of text. you're essentially allowed to make up your own spellings as long as people could understand you, right? So if people cannot understand you, obviously you have a problem. But if they still can figure it out, well, then no big deal. Now, this is the basic composition of the Maya sound system from the classic period. The only big point of disagreement between scholars who reconstruct Mayan languages is the vowels. So in this version, you have short and long vowels, very much like in English. And very much like in English, those are meaningful distinctions. So in English, peat and pit are different words. You can have a pit in a pit filled with peat, but you cannot have a peat in a pit. Although I guess you can probably have one, but yeah. But that's pretty much the idea, right? You change the length and the meaning of the word changes as well. So with Mayan languages, there is a big debate between several groups of linguists whether or not Mayan languages started out as having glottalized and long vowels and later collapsed to short vowels. Many Mayan languages today only have short vowels, although some languages, like Yucatec, have vowels and tones. Yes, there is a Mayan language with tones. Fortunately, we don't have to learn it. It has rising, descending, and neutral tones today. But those presumably actually emerged because of context with Spanish. Like weird interaction between languages. But Cholan languages don't have tones, and they don't have long vowels or glottalized vowels. But different linguists reconstruct earlier stages of the Mayan language differently. And so there's a group that says, well, early Mayan, common Mayan had glottalized and long vowels, and then vowels with soft h in them, which then all collapsed into short. And then there's an alternative reconstruction that argues for long vowels with h, long vowels with glottal stop, vowels with glottal stop and he, and then long vowels with glottal stop and he, and then long vowels with glottal stop. So more vowels. And of course also means more variation through the time when classic script was in use. And remember, these are reconstructions. That's just linguists looking at modern Mayan languages and trying to imagine what their ancestral versions were like, say, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, and so on. But we have alternative reconstructions. It became clear very early on in the understanding and the studies of Mayan writing that there were different spellings, different patterns of spellings. So some spellings, especially with syllables, it was obvious that they were using a principle of silent vowels. So you have a syllable ba and then a syllable ka, and they seem to spell the word bak, like, and that last a, you're not supposed to read it. And the vowel of the second syllable is the same as the vowel of the root monosyllabic word that you're trying to spell. So we sometimes represent those spellings as CV1, CV1. So constant vowel one, constant vowel one. One means it's the same, right? Vowel one, vowel one. But some spellings were not like that. They had a different vowel, and not always the same. So say, instead of writing baka, I write baku or baki. And you start wondering, like, what the hell is going on, right? So is baki same as baka and baku, or is baki same as baku but not the same as baka? So those weird spellings were called disharmonic spellings, as opposed to synharmonic spellings where all the vowels are the same. And so the big question for epigraphers was whether or not there's any pattern, any system to this variation in spellings. And there are basically three kinds of solutions here. One, these different vowels actually clue the vowels of another syllable, which is not fully spelled. Say, I want to spell the word sakun. So I could have spelled it as sakunu, but I'm lazy. And in pronunciation, that final N is so weak that it is often dropped. So I just spell it as saku. It's a kind of abbreviation. So that's one solution. So in this case, our baka, baki, baku, they just spell different suffixes. So bakil, bakal, bakul. The second solution is that there is a distinction that is largely binary. So they spell complicated vowels, not just short vowels, but perhaps not distinguishing much between different kinds of complicated, complex vowels. And then the third solution is that some of this variation, they're actually trying to distinguish between different kinds of complex vowels. So long vowels, articulated vowels. And of course, that ties to how we reconstruct those vowels in the language of my hieroglyphs. So these are some of our basic synharmonic spellings. As you can imagine, a lot of early decipherment relied on this kinds of spellings because they're the easiest to understand. Right? So laka, maka, witsi, mo, kutsu, sulu. In all of these examples, there's no doubt that there is no suffix being spelled. These are just words. Consonant, vowel, consonant, basic sort of typical root of my languages. And it's all that is spelled. And the vowel is always silent. So even with the word mo, maka, even though it looks to us like it is a consonant vowel word, to the Maya, it's actually a consonant vowel consonant word because there's a glottal stop at the end. And Maya perceived glottal stop as a consonant, very much like speakers of Semitic languages. So then you have these disharmonic spellings. So like tema, awila, putsi, atki, bakti, chaki, muti, muwa, ni, yokti, yototti. So then the question is, what do these things stand for? Some of them, towards the end of the classic period, around 800 AD, you can actually see them spelled synharmonically too. So the word at, penis, is spelled at t and then at ta. The word for foot, his foot, yok, ti, is now spelled as yoko. The word for hawk, muwani, muwan, is spelled muwan na. And the word for bone, baki, is spelled as baka. From those changes in spelling came the proposal by Houston, Stewart, and Robertson. And Houston is more of a theory person. Stewart, of course, is the top myographer full time, and Robertson is a linguist. And their proposal was that you do have a distinction between words with short vowels and words with other kinds of vowels, say long or rearticulated or glottalized or with soft h. And Maya scribes tried to indicate the difference between short vowels and other kinds of vowels. Then during the classic period, that distinction started fading away, reflecting the present day situation in which you only have short vowels. So for a time being, Maya scribes tried to represent it, and then they give up. And so some scribal schools just shifted to short vowels only. And that's why we have these late spellings, which basically are all synharmonic. So that's the idea, right? You had muwan with a long vowel, and then muwan with a short vowel. At some point, obviously before the spellings actually shifted, that long vowel became short. People continued writing it, very much like we today write the word night for knift, even though we don't say knift anymore. And then some scribal schools just gave up and started writing the way they heard it. And same, of course, is bak for bone, bak, at for penis, at, ok for foot, ok. So that was a very neat proposition. The only problem there was not all spellings which appear to be synharmonic in Maya writing correspond to long vowels, or correspond to short vowels. Some spellings correspond to words which are reconstructed as having a long vowel or a glottalized vowel. And so that was an obvious problem with this interpretation. Robertson, Houston, and Stewart solved it by using the concept of markedness. It's actually a very important concept in linguistics, but also in anthropology in general. Like the way we classify our world is often into marked and unmarked categories. Think about it this way, like jobs and gender. Most jobs are marked. We don't really say which gender the job is in, but historically, we assume those jobs are male because of the existing gender imbalances. So when the job becomes female, you add something to it, like a seamstress, waitress. That S is indicator that the job is specifically female. So in the male-dominated world, the male categories are marked, and the female category is marked because you only care to mark the gender when it's female gender. You highlight that these are specifically allowed for women to have. So in this way, the language categories reflect social categories. And of course, in a world where we want these things to be a little different, we want to change those. But our language reflects realities the way they used to be. So that's an example of markedness when you mark gender in relation to labor. But the same thing can apply to other things, say to sounds. Say in the word bicycle, I have two letters C. One of them I actually read as S, but the other one I read as K. In the word knock, I have two letters K, but one of them I don't read at all. That's in knock knock. So there's a combination in English which is CK, which is a marked K sound, right? CK always has to be read as K, as a sound K, regardless of its position in a word. So basically, because English shifted its pronunciation so much that some C's now sound as K's, and some K's no longer have any sound at all, English orthography shifted to using this basically a combination of two letters to indicate what here you definitely have to pronounce it as K. And that's what we call markedness. So CK is a marked K sound. But there are other ways to spell K in English, except they're not like guaranteed, right? They're not, you have to know from context. Some of those Ks, it's actually silent Ks, and some of those Cs, you actually pronounce them as S. Or say lost versus roast. The O, sometimes it's O in English too, just letter O, but OA is a definite O. There's no other way to spell it. So that's pretty much the idea with like complex vowels in my writing. They're just marked. Some scribes decide that those are cases in which you really have to indicate it, probably because they're words with short vowels, which generate confusion. And so those spellings historically accidentally become more highlighted, right? That they have complex vowels. So these are just some of the combinations, right? And the idea is that these seem to generally correspond to long vowels and also in fixed H. And they usually are marked with a syllable with E. AU combinations, EU combinations are also mostly long vowel, VH, and short vowel. And then these combinations, when the syllable is U in the first, when the syllabic sign is U in the first syllable and a consonant A in the second complement, they seem to be indicating a broader range of vowels with glottalization. So that was sort of the original proposal. There were attempts to push it further because, of course, there's still a problem that you can have long vowels and glottalized vowels. And some of those also form minimal pairs. So Alfonso Lacadena, Soren Wichmann, and later Cecil Brown. And they're, of course, the proponents of more complex syllabic nuclei in the Mayan languages, which means like more vowels. They, in fact, suggested that we have another layer of complexity. Different kinds of phonetic complements actually are used to mark different kinds of complex vowels. So AI combination includes long vowel, and IA is a reflection of that for cases when the first syllable is I with E. And then AU and UA, those are cluing glottalized vowels. So there's another binary distinction in the system. There's some minimal pairs. And by minimal pairs, we mean that these spellings are definitely spelling different vowels, and the distinction creates different meaning. So say pot is to shape, pot is back. These are different words, meaning different things, very much like English, Pete and pit. Kal and kal. Kal is score, 20. Kal is room, enclosure. You don't want to mix those up. Chan and chan, one is sky, the other one is literally the one who oversees, like a guardian, which is used for usually like babysitters, bodyguards, and those who have captives. Because I guess these are comparable jobs. So like we have images of my babysitters occasionally. Like there's a job, Uchan Chok, literally the one who oversees the young people. So my version of primary school teacher, I guess. And then bak, bone versus bak, child or young person. So those are minimal pairs. And you see most of them are short versus long, but some of long versus glottalized. There are also spellings which change over time. And that also implies that there's some difference there, pronunciation-wise, right? Not just between short and long, but also between glottalized, long and short. So you have the word for centipede, and spelled early on as chapatu, later as chapati, and then as chapata, suggesting that originally it was chapat with a glottalized vowel, and then chapat with a long one, and finally chapat with a short. One of the data points that kind of strongly suggested that we're dealing with something that is specifically designed to highlight glottalized vowels with the glottal stop right after the vowel is this weird convention for some of these cases when there seems to be a plurality of options for my scribes to record the same kind of vowel. This is the same name. The name is Nunuholchak. The head of the rain god, Chak, is mute. I have no idea why his head is mute, but it just says so, the name. And so in the name of the same known Tikal ruler, the scribes chose to write it as Nu Holchak, Nu U Holchak, that's indicating the glottal stop, but missing the last consonant N, right? And here you have another Nu U Holchak. Here it's the same thing, but then you also get spellings like Nu Na Holchak, the disharmonic spelling. And that A cannot spell a suffix because you can actually underspell the whole thing down to Nu. That implies that you don't really have another syllable there. Or Nu U Nu Holchak. So that U here basically indicates glottal stop. And that's a very strong indicator that the glottal stop is what they really want to mark with this disharmonic Nu-Na spelling. Right? Because in addition to Na, they can also write it as Nu, Nu-U, and then Nu-U-Nu for noon, for Holchak. Unfortunately, there are very few examples like that. There are also a few cases when in Western dialects used in my writing, the H inserted into the syllables and usually not represented at all in writing, like in Ach, Bachlam, Buch, Tihl. But in the Western dialects, they often pronounce it as a glottal stop. So you get this weird combination. Instead of writing Sami earlier today, which has to be Sahmi, according to reconstructions from modern nine languages, they write it as Sami. So that H becomes a glottal stop. And there are other weird examples from the same category, like Ukti is written as Uti as opposed to Uti, because that H becomes, they hear it as glottal stop, they write it as if it had a glottal stop. So they reanalyze the vowel and it's reflecting the spellings. So these are basically the existing proposals. But there are problems with nearly all of these interpretations. One, how rigid the spelling rules should be. Like, did my scribes really strive to be phonetically transparent all the time? The change between vowel, the shifts of vowel complexity did happen during the classic period, from glottalized to long to short. And there's still a question of how soon it happened. What was sort of the baseline when my writing was invented? And there is no clear understanding because we just don't have enough data. The problem when each team discussing spelling rules has its own linguist is dangerous because it's easy to start developing circular arguments. So like, well, we have the spelling, but the reconstruction doesn't fit. Is there a way to make it fit? What if we consider Western Mind languages? Aha, it seems to be working. And so these kinds of arguments, they are unfortunately common. So right now we have three major groups. Everything is on the spelling. It's binary, short versus long. It's glottalized, long, and it's actually specifically indicated. So each group has its own linguist. Three alternative reconstruction of vowel system of classic period language. And it's impossible to argue with each other because they disagree about the baseline linguistic data. People like me who are unaffiliated in three camps, although Houston is my former mentor. So we just have to say that we agree to disagree. Like, don't ask, don't tell. You don't ask me about spelling rules, I'm not telling you about spelling rules. That's the basic rule of avoiding like brawls at epigraphy conferences. We don't talk about spelling rules. We know they exist. We know it's complicated, but we're all friends here. And that's how it happens. But there are problems, of course, with spelling rules. And just think about this example. So I write something like this. And it's sa, ku. Now, what am I trying to say here? Is it sak? Is it sak? And it turns out it's none of those. It's older brother, sakun. That an is, yeah, that an is weak and they just ignore it most of the time. And we know it is sakun because we have so many examples. And sometimes followed by winik, sakun winik, older brother. So that doesn't seem to be working at all. We do have cases when things are clearly forming a pattern. Form a pattern. These are place names. So you would expect a phonetically transparent system to have every vowel represented with place name suffix, which is vowel L. But most of the place names are actually recorded with a single syllable la, and it's used to spell most of the suffixes anyway. So regardless of which vowel precedes it, can be O, can be E, can be E, there is a small subset of I's. Linguistic reconstructions say that the vowel has to be long. But if the vowel is long, then these examples do not fit. Because the third proposal argues that that has to be glottalized vowel, according to these conventions. But linguistic reconstructions do not support it. It has to be long. So what do you do with those? How you explain the fact that what we have here is basically like English plural or like English past tense. This is a morphosyntaxis. It's a particular kind of suffix and they use one sign to spell it, with some exceptions, but exceptions are really few. So what is going on? Well, the same group of scholars who suggested the markedness and sort of binary distinction, being aware of this challenge of dealing with multiple spellings, which don't seem to clearly fall into predicted patterns with respect to linguistic reconstructions, argued that what we have is basically a form of morphosynthesis, very much like English morphosyntaxis, when you actually have certain characters which just spell suffixes. They call them morphosyllables. The only problem with this method is that the argument went a little further than, say, people who interpret English. In English, this is still letter S, right? It started out as letter S, and then later on, through conventions, became a marker of plural. Still, it's the same letter. We just recognize that it spells the plural. The morphosyllabic hypothesis argues that some of these signs were invented to spell suffixes and function primarily as suffixes, which many epigraphers refuse to accept. But there's no question that what we have with many Maya characters, they used consistently to spell certain suffixes and occasionally prefixes, regardless of how those are pronounced with respect to the vowels. So like in place names, it's actually a long vowel, and specific long vowel is the same as the preceding vowel. So there's those examples here are hal, tantel, matawil, panil, kokol, mol, akul, tanul. Those vowels are all long, but they're spelled with the same suffix. It seems to be a convention, right? But la is not a suffix that initially marks place names, just place names. It also marks adjectives, like vowel l adjectives, a lot of them spelled with the same l, or abstract nouns. So it's not like the sign itself has a specific grammatical meaning. It's just in some recognizable context, consistency of spellings is important so that people could recognize a place name. It sounds like a fine distinction, but believe it or not, that's not a major fault line, like morphosyllables or not, between mostly US and European scholars working with Markedness. And that, of course, is another problem, like ma can be a suffix of instrumental nouns or agents, like chahom, one who scatters, the priest, ayom, one who sings, the singer. But also it's a suffix of plural in nouns. So if it's a morphosyllable, what is it morphosyllable of? Plural, certain nouns. It's much easier to imagine that it's just a syllable and then it's used morphemically in various contexts and in different ways. It doesn't carry any kind of inherent meaning as a sign, grammatical meaning. Once again, it may sound like a little too theoretical, but of course it's important when you try to read inscriptions. If you assume that certain characters always carry inherent grammatical meaning, that's one thing. And if you assume that characters in themselves do not carry any grammatical meaning, but may be spelled consistently to indicate certain kinds of suffixes, then those are actually very different things. And yes, say wa with transitive verbs, like I took, he took, we took. So all verbs with this suffix are spelled with the same character wa, regardless of the vowel of the verb root, of the verb stem. That's very morphemic. That's very much like English ed, always spelled with e and d. But the y itself can mean all kinds of things. The word li, is it a morphosyllable il? Is it a morphosyllable vowel l? Well, when you actually want to say my lord, the way you pronounce it is wawal. It's kind of crazy, but the word for lord is how. And when you say wahao, my lord, it actually means my vessel, like the lord I possess. And I want to say my lord, like my superior, that requires a different suffix. So the suffix is al. And then because Mayas don't like very long words, most of the word ahao, lord, is dropped. Only the first and the last sound remain. So the word ahao becomes ao. So my lord is not wahawal, it's just wawal. And we have spellings, wa, wa, li. Obviously, this is not a morphemic spelling, right? It's just a phonetic pronunciation of how you're supposed to say it. Although we do have spellings as wa, ahau, li. which seems to be more morphemic in nature, like emphasizing the root is still the same, very much like English hymn with an at the end versus hymnal. That you want to say that this is the same root, right? In both cases, though in hymn, that n is not spelled at all. You understand, right? The hymn versus hymnal. That n is a silent n. In the same way is wahawal, that aha in the middle is silent when it's possessed. But you want to spell it sometimes because you want to say this, the same word, Lord. So where does it leave us? When we look at actual Maya spellings, it turns out Maya scribes faced the challenge of staying correct to meaning or staying correct to sound differently, because there was no professor telling them what to do, or whoever was telling them to do didn't necessarily have the same opinion as the person who lived next door in a different city, like 10 miles away. This is a great example. So in nearly all Mayan languages, when two vowels meet, one of them has to go. Very much like French liaison. So if you have a preposition that ends in a vowel, and you have to attach it to a word that begins with a vowel, one of these vowels will go. And the surviving vowel gets a glottal stop that basically tells you there used to be a vowel here, not anymore. So when I say ta utun in its year, that a in ta will go, and u will get a glottal. So ta utun would become tu tun, tu glottal tun. So it's a phonetic process. It's required. There's no way to avoid it. But it also means that the preposition ta will have to be spelled with a different syllabic sign, right? I can no longer use ta. I have to use tu. So what do Maya scribes do? One solution, do nothing. Just write it ta u buluk tun in its 11th year. This is a phonetically impossible spelling. You cannot actually pronounce it if you're a speaker of Maya language. Tau cannot go. So this spelling is phonetically impossible, but grammatically correct. This person loves grammar and doesn't care. What matters more is consistency in how you represent, in this case, preposition ta and prefix u. So it's grammar over phonology. There's a solution number 2. In this case, in its 13th year, tu hush lahun tun. This is closer to pronunciation, but not entirely accurate because the glottal stop is not indicated. So more or less accurate, but not entirely. So should have been tu hush lahun tun. Then you have example number 3, which is kah lahun tu ba, and the speech match is the same, right? Just tu, no glottal stop. But there is one example. Somebody was really phonetically conscious. And this is a statement to pat, literally behind, in its back. That's how Maya would say behind someone. So in the back. So it's ti or ta, u pat, and they become connected, except that here it's written as tu, u, pa, ti, indicating a glottal stop. So this is a phonetically transparent spelling. Tu, pat. So everything that has to be there is there. Now, it's the only example. Most of the known examples, they're in the category of this or that, suggesting that phonetic transparency is not a big deal. Analytical spellings are also less common, suggesting that morphological transparency is important, but not too much. Right? So, like, consistently spelling the same preposition seems to be a concern for some scribes, but not to all of them. So it's flexible. People are flexible. Surprise. There are similar examples of sort of Maya authors struggling with how you consistently represent same words in writing, even though pronunciations change from one grammar form to another, very much like hymn and hymnal. So the words to be born literally means to become a gift, which is kind of beautiful metaphor. The logogram for gift is a froggy with like little frog eggs. I have no idea why, but that's what Maya thinks of gift and birth, froggies. Maybe because the earth goddess is a frog. And there is one image of her with like a giant frog with lots of baby frogs. And it's an earth goddess because Central American frogs, they actually hibernate underground. And they emerge like life after death from hibernation. So there is this little Sikh logogram. The problem is that when you derive to become a gift, siyah, that h is replaced by y glide. So you're supposed to pronounce it siyah. It means that you can no longer use this logogram, but that would create inconsistency. So most of my scribes just write Sikh yah ha. It's not because they pronounce Sikh yah. They pronounce it siyah. They just want some continuities. You know, they're still talking about the same thing. Very much like English consistency in the spelling of certain roots. And sometimes they write it syllabically as siyaha. There's one example in which it's sihiyaha, which seems to be an overemphasis on like this is the root, by the way. Here's another example which is more ambivalent. Och bihi, literally road enter, but that bihi loses the middle h very quickly on, becomes och bih. So this spelling is probably phonetically correct, och bih. And here's another, och bih on a much later text. And then this is a grammatical overcorrection. Like they spell it with the root bih, spelled bihi, and then the suffix ha, even though this is not how you pronounce it. This is more like, this is the root is bih. So it's och enter, bih, road, and then the suffix that gives the verbal meaning, road enter. So it's like some kind of grammar obsessed person did that. Same goes with the burning logogram. The burning is tah, but when it's a participial form, like someone is burning, it's tayal or tayel. And same thing here, you can use the logogram with la, but some scribes decide to write it phonetically, tayal or tayel. And believe it or not, that was a huge problem to us because there seemed to be no connection between the logogram and some of the syllabic spellings. The only clue came when we realized that one Persian is spelled with those, like the same name. And al and el turn out to be dialectal suffixes. We don't know why, but it affects a whole range of nouns, including some of the pronouns like et and at. And places which have el, they also have et versus at. So some local dialectal difference that we don't understand fully, but it's there. So there are other weird things, right? That older brother, Saku, a whole class of verbs are spelled without silent vowels at all. So you're supposed to read the whole word. Ochi, huli, tali, sliba, ani. No idea why. People try to imagine that those are in fact disharmonic spellings. It doesn't work. People try to imagine those as synharmonic spellings. It doesn't work. The only way to fit these spellings into our reconstructions of verbs is to assume that everything is pronounced. Imperative, you also pronounce everything, like pulu, throw, hat'a, strike. No idea why, but that's how my scribes write it. And then things can be abbreviated in my writing too, like sakun, it's in. Anything with n is frequently abbreviated. This is a statement about the arrival of the ancestral founder, and it says the feet of Awil rested, and it has to be Hili rested, Yokel, the feet of Awil. So here, instead of saying Yokele, they wrote okay. They dropped the prefix, they dropped the suffix. There's no other way to explain it. They just did. The word sahal, small or perhaps fearsome. Some people prefer to translate it as fearsome, other as small. Perhaps tells a lot about people who translate it rather than the word itself. But here it's spelled properly, sahala. Here it's saha. And this is an extreme example, just sa. And we know it's the same word. You got to abbreviate it. Because these inscriptions, people sometimes abbreviate, they run out of space. This is a fellow who was captured at some point. And his own name is the captor of the dear person. Like he captured someone and then he himself got captured. Maya rulers, Maya warriors sometimes have this title, which is like the guardian, the captor of X. And it's usually their first capture, like the first time they won in hand-to-hand combat and captured someone and then obviously sacrificed the poor guy. The name is spelled clearly once. And we know it's the same person because he appears like in several texts which are related from the same area. It's Uchan, the guardian of Achich, literally dear man or dear person, personally, or he who has dear. Here it's Chan, Achich, and Chan is spelled with number 4 because it's a homonym. The vowel length by that time collapsed, so they don't care. And here it's Chan, Na, Achich, which is still wrong, like in that example, like the vowel is wrong, but once again, the vowel collapsed. Otherwise, they would never use number 4 for the same meaning. So we know that. What is interesting though, they dropped the prefix, the possessed prefix. So it's not like the guardian of, it's just guardian Achich. And that's the most confusing part because it really affects meaning and they don't care. And since then, we became aware of more of the examples when they drop the possessive third person prefix. Like the word grandfather and grandson is actually the same word in Mayan languages because grandchildren are basically a reincarnation of their grandparents. So they're mom to each other. Very cute. But the problem is someone is mom so-and-so. Now we know that there are 2 ways of interpreting it. One, he's like grandpa so-and-so, which is like referential. Like you talk to your ancestor, like the grandpa, like someone who's elderly, someone who is senior. But it can also mean the maternal grandson and so-and-so. And it's maybe very important because of the connection through the mother to another royal line. And sometimes that grandson versus grandparent is clear because it's in the right spot after one's personal name. And it's usually like your name, then it says that your maternal grandson and so-and-so, the son of mother, so-and-so, son of father, so-and-so. In those statements, it's very obvious that that's what they want to mean, even though there is no prefix. But sometimes you get it in like captions to someone's name, and then you don't know. Are they talking about someone who's old, or are they talking about someone who's unimportant but has an important grandpa? And it may affect a lot, like the interpretation of what's going on in the text, right? Especially when they depict a child. Is it a child who now is old, that's why he's grandpa? Or is it a child who's actually a child at the time of the event, but has an important grandpa? And that can make a big difference trying to, say, interpret political alliances between the kingdoms. So no way to tell, but these things happen. And they basically mean that, yes, my scribes, they didn't go all to the same school. Different city-states. No enforcement of spelling rules. It's free for all, which of course is complicating our life as epigraphers quite a bit. So Maya scribes probably, I mean, how we learn to write in English. Even in English, we learn mostly through repetition. Like we learn certain groups of words, right? Those functional words especially. We read them, we write them until we know them. Maya scribes probably did the same thing, starting with frequent words, copying text, copying spellings, learning that the way you're supposed to write the word stone is tun, ni, even though you've pronounced it as tun. because that's how it's supposed to be done. Like we today, we write the word knight for a guy in the shining armor, and we write with silent K and H, and we just do it. So Maya scribes probably did it the same way, but because they didn't have a single national curriculum, they had a lot of localized traditions and weird things happening from time to time. And this practice of repetition and replication, resulting in what we would call fossilized or habitual spellings. But here are some examples which are obvious, right? These are common terms for things on drinking cups. So this is the word yukib, literally someone's drinking utensil. And it has to be UEB, except that here it's spelled as EUB. Either because the author of the text has some like dyslexia problems, or because he or she decided that it was prettier that way. Here it's UTB Hanala instead of UTB Nahala. Same thing. Like we don't know why. Probably because it's prettier. I mean, it doesn't look pretty to us, but I mean, we're not in a position to judge what is pretty when it comes to Maya letters and what is not. Here, it's the name of a person who is mentioned several times because he was unfortunate and got captured by the king of Yashalan, who paraded him many times and kept him near his body occasionally for various public events. So there are all the depictions of the poor fellow. And his name was Yellow Vulture. Yes, some Maya kings and nobles have very fancy names like rain gods and sun gods and lightning, but a lot of ordinary folk had names like monkey, vulture, white coati, hale monkey. There was one whose name was I think it was like monkey, kinkajou, deer, and I forgot, and jaguar, all the same name. I don't know how many of you have seen a real kinkajou. Kinkajou is kind of animal. Have you ever kinkajou? Yeah, I once took care of baby kinkajou. It was very cute. Called him Panchito. But they're raccoons actually. They're from the same family as raccoons, but they look like a crossover between cat and a monkey. Very long tongues, like this long. This guy was Yellow Vulture, Kan Usih, except that in this example they wrote it as Kan Na Si Uha for no reason at all, because they could. But we know it's Usi, first of all, because it's the only combination of letters that makes sense. And second, because there are other examples of the same person, with the same name, recorded normally. So we call it a static transposition because there's no other way of describing it. Like we come up with these nice descriptions when we don't understand what's going on. So there are other cases when it looks like someone has a combination of letters and they begin to think about it as if it were the same word, right? They stop thinking of these as distinct characters, begin to think of them as a new character, very much like we would analyze some of complex spellings in English. So the first example is chak, cho, ko. And so obviously that ko in the ear, and you have already struggled with Maya conflations. You know it's not easy. Apparently that scribe had an issue with that too. He basically forgot that ko was there. So he wrote another ko next to it. So conflations are hard. They were hard for my scribes too. That one, chu ku kaha. So that ku in the middle got lost. So whoever was learning these things probably learned it as either a variant of syllable chu or actually as a low grub chuk. And then felt compelled to add another ka in there for clarity purposes. This one has a conflation of a and pa that once again somebody reanalyzed as a logogram up to plant. You have eat a pa pa ha instead of eat a pa ha. It's a fully syllabic spelling, but with two pa syllables, because one of these pa syllables was no longer seen as a syllable. Most likely was seen as a weird form of letter ta or as a new letter up altogether. In this case, you have a ba sign with an a inside. But by that time, this character And those characters, one of these was different. First of all, this character was no longer ach, it was just in the late 8th century. And then this sign, the second was probably seen as part of the kaba logogram. So once again, instead of writing kaba for name, and with the glottal stop at the end, this is kaba. So what happens is people look at these spellings, they replicate these spellings as they learn, and they forget. They literally forget about the signs inside because they begin to think of them as just logograms. And when they feel compelled to indicate something else, something additional, they just put an extra sign, which is excessive. Or you have a sign kalomte, which is usually spelled as kal tema for kalom te, the tree splinter, tree cutter, supreme title of my rulers, because I guess they make forest. They cut forest for milpa. This example though is kal ma te. One of these te's kind of got lost, like in the sense that it became part of the kal logogram for the scribe. So the scribe felt like they actually needed a te letter. They couldn't understand where the te was in a conflated kal te form. And this is one of my favorites. This is a sign ak with ak. So this is ak. Ak. And that sign below is ach. Ach. It's actually one of those clear morphosyllabic signs because it's always ach and it's used to spell agentive prefixes and agentive suffixes early on. Very specific and very different from a common a. A common a is like this. That's just a, and this is ach. What happens is that towards the end of the classic period, they no longer know that this is ach. They read the sign as ah, that h dropped. And then you end up you have a problem because you want a word that is spelled like this. And my scribes have spellings which they now analyze as taka. They don't understand what is going on. Right? You open your books and it's written taka everywhere. And you know it's correct spelling because your teacher told you so. But a consonant is missing. So they start adding another sign, ha, right? So you end up with spellings like u, tak, a, ha, not because there is any vowel hiding in there. It's still taka. Or my favorite, u, tak, ka, a, ha. Something definitely went wrong there. But it makes sense if you consider how people learn to write, right? In this case, they learn spellings, the spellings are fixed, but then the pronunciation changes. So you have to live with that. Sometimes we see different spellings, especially when the context is not formal, like pottery. There's less informal production, specifically for individual patrons, not like you carve a monument. So this is from the same workshop or related workshops, working for the same king, same time frame, around 780s. And here they refer to a bowl court, a bowl game area, like a stadium, which in the Maya tongue is yellow scratching paved surface, or precious scratching paved surface, because scratching is what the bowl does. We understand, although still weird. But they write stone part as tuni here with the long vowel, and it's just syllabic tunu here with a short vowel, because they don't care, right? But on monuments, it's always written as tuni from that same time period, indicating long vowel, because that's the proper way of writing the word for stone, even though it's pronounced as tun with a short one. So with syllables, they don't have this issue, right? They just write it the way they hear it. With logograms, they write it as if the vowel were still long. And finally, this is the last example I wanted to show you. Sometimes weird spellings are probably intentional because they spell weird words. That's another thing. So there's a name of a ruler of Yasha, late 8th century, in each lakam tun, literally resplendent great rock. Nice name for a king. This is a text written by someone who was the enemy of the great mighty rock. In fact, it was on a drinking vessel given to a young warrior, probably as a kind of gift celebrating his achievement in a long military campaign against this resplendent great rock. And there's an official monument at the site of Naranco, the location of the regional capital, of which this guy was a distant military captain of the vessel of the king of Naranco, where the name of the great mighty rock is recorded correctly many times. On the vessel, though, they write it differently. Instead of writing Inich Lakam Tun, they write it as Inich Lakam Nun. And there's no doubt that this is not a mistake. There's just no way someone could mix up syllables tu and nu. They don't look anything alike. And other than that, it's a perfectly normal text. So at first, we thought, the epigraphers who encountered this text, well, maybe it's some kind of weird transition, probably use syllables. And then realized maybe this is just a joke. Like they were fighting against this fellow back and forth for 10 years. At one point losing, and then eventually winning, capturing him and burning him alive. And there are monuments showing that. So Kinish Lakamtun literally means mighty great mute, like a deaf person. I mean, maybe he was not good at vocalizing, he was not a great speaker. So maybe his enemies really talked about him, like he's the mighty rock to his followers, and mighty idiot to his enemies. And so this is not an official monument. This is an informal consumption sort of cup. And so maybe to reflect sort of the running joke that these like military guys, when they went to war, right? That's how they called him. So they're part of the propaganda basically during the wartime. Like, and the spellings reflect that on the vase, not on official monuments, not in stone. So it's not a mistake. It's totally intentional. It's actually like a pun. Like an actual pun, a historical pun. And so that's sort of an extra layer with spelling rules that we sometimes have to take into account when we have enough context of what's actually going on. So that's all. That's all I wanted to discuss. Just remember, it's in harmony, disharmony. Everything is tied to how we reconstruct languages. And unfortunately for the Maya, there are alternative reconstructions of vowels. Spellings do seem to be used to consistently spell suffixes and prefixes in certain ways, but the system is a lot less rigid that we'd like it to be. And there is some way of representing complex vowels, but they're also underspellings. So a lot of it is context based as the